Welcome to the First Hebrew Primer, Chapter 13. Let's go ahead and take a look at the vocabulary. In the upper right here, we have the word Adamah, which is translated ground or earth. It's a feminine noun, Adamah. You can see the wordplay there with the word man. Adam is man, right? Where does he come from? The Adamah, from the ground. Below that is the word ein. We're going to talk about this in the lesson this week. It's called a negative particle of existence, and it's translated normally there is not or there are not. Below that, we have what's called a demonstrative pronoun. It's the near demonstrative pronoun, ele, translated these. And it's probably worth writing this down in your vocabulary. This is a third person plural demonstrative pronoun. Third person plural, these. Okay, below that, we have the word aim, which is mother. Aim is mother. Below that, we have another particle that is pronounced hine, and the King James normally translates it behold. Many other translations do as well. It means something more like look here or pay attention. And it's an important discourse feature we'll talk about in this course and when you get into Hebrew syntax and exegesis. Below, the last two on this column are two more demonstrative pronouns. There's a feminine singular demonstrative pronoun, zot, and ze is the masculine singular demonstrative pronoun. They're both translated this, zot and ze. In the upper left, we have the word zerah, which is translated seed or descendants. Then we have the word si, yam. Si is a masculine noun there. Below that is yesh. This is the positive counterpart to the word ein we looked at over here. So this is like the positive particle of existence, you might want to say. It's often translated there is or there are. Below that we have the word lila, which means night. And then below that we have the word ruach, which means wind or spirit. And then below that we have the word for sky or heavens, shemayim. Notice it has that dual ending, and it always has that, just like the word water is mayim, the word for heaven or sky is shemayim. And then below that is a word you might be familiar with, Torah, which is law or instruction. Now there are some idioms that the textbook highlights here. These first two, we're just putting the directional hey on the words, but it translates in ways you might not expect. Here we have yama, which is the word sea, yam, with a directional hey. So normally you would translate that toward the sea, which is pretty straightforward. However, in many contexts in the Old Testament, a better translation is to translate it westward. Often the biblical writers will use the word sea to indicate west. So if you think of the geography of ancient Israel, what's to the west of them? Well, the Mediterranean Sea. And so when they talk about traveling west, they'll often say, Yama, I'm going westward, which means, very literally toward the sea. But they're not really referring to the sea. They're just talking about the direction of travel to the west. Below that, you have the word heavens with a definite article and a directional hey, hashemayma, and that's translated toward the heaven or heavenward. And then finally, the definite article on the word night, lila, say halayla, means tonight. There's no other Hebrew word for tonight. It's the night, means tonight. Okay, let's talk about sentences without verbs for a minute, or a verbless clause, or a noun sentence is what your textbook calls it. In English, every sentence, right, has to have a subject and a verb. In Hebrew, though, it's possible to construct a sentence with a number of words and no apparent verb at all. There is no equivalent in Hebrew for a word that can be translated as is, am, or are, particularly in the way that we normally use it in English. Instead of that, they'll either put nouns or pronouns next to other words, and in English, we need to supply the verb is or are in order to translate it for it to make sense in English. So let's go ahead and look at some examples of this. Here's two quick examples here. In Hebrew, it's Haim Kohanim. Literally, it's they, priests. Well, that is not a phrase that communicates very well in English, right? They, priests. We need a verb there. And so in English, we need to supply the verb that's in parentheses here. They are priests. And this is super common in biblical Hebrew. Here's an example below. Anachnu b'Moav. You have the pronoun we next to the preposition beit, next to the proper name Moab. So literally this is we in Moab. But again, we need a verb there in English. So we want to supply what's in parentheses there. We are in Moab. So let's look at some more examples of this. What you might wonder, well, how do you know if it's past, present, or future if there's no verb? And the answer is context is going to have to tell you. So look at this first example. Hu David. Literally, this is he, David. We need to say he is David or he was David. We don't necessarily know the time to say if it's past, present, or future, but let's say we have a larger context. We can say, Ra'iti ish v'hu David. I saw a man and he was David. Or you might say it was David or he was David. There we know it's past tense because it comes right after this perfect verb right here. Here's another example. Anachnu nashim. We are women or we will be women. You know, how do we translate that? Look at the sentence. Amarnu ki anachnu nashim. We said that we were women. So because of the perfect verb, you know that it should be translated as a past tense. Here's another example. Zeh habayit. This is that pronoun we just looked at. This is the house or this was the house. Let's look at a larger context. Zeh habayit. This will be the house where Moses will dwell there. And because it's an imperfect, it's related to that imperfect verb. You know it's more of a future-oriented pronoun. Okay, so here's I'm trying to think about where to put my face. I'll go right there. So here's another feature of biblical Hebrew that's helpful to know, and that is Hebrew will often use an extra pronoun, particularly in the third person. So here's an example. We have Ha'av hu melech, the father, he is king. We need to supply the verb he here. The father, he is king. That can sound a little bit redundant in English. And so a better way, a smoother way of translating that is just to say the father is king. Some grammarians actually think the pronoun who here is actually functioning like a verb. And so they would actually say that's the functional way to translate it, is to say the father is king. Or below we have Sarah, he, ha'im. Sarah is the mother. Just pointing out that the pronouns have to agree in gender and number with the noun that they refer to. Okay, let's look at the use of the particle yesh. Now, you already know the verb haya, which in the perfect tense, we talked about how it can be translated as there are or there were, kind of with that like dummy subject. So these first two examples show that there was a man in the field, or there were people in the field. We've already talked about how you can do that. Well, there is another and even more common way of communicating the idea of there is or there are in Hebrew, and that's using this particle of existence. This is actually not a verb. This is a particle. It does not inflect like a verb. The only form that you'll ever see it in is what it looks like right here, yesh, and you translate it either there is or there were or there are, depending on if the noun that comes after it is singular or plural. So here, because the noun that comes after it is singular, you'd say, there is a man in the field. Yesh ish basadeh. If the word that comes after it is plural, like anashim, you'll say, there are people in the field. Again, the word yesh does not inflect. It doesn't have to agree with any other word in the sentence. It can be used with masculine nouns, feminine nouns, singular, plural. It doesn't matter. You just have to know in English, you have to nuance it either singular or plural. There is or there are or there were. Again, the time frame for this also comes from the context, whether it's going to be translated past, present, or future. Okay, now let's take a look at the negative particle of existence here. The word ain. The word ein means there is not or there are not. It's the negative way that you normally say yesh if you want to say it positively. If you want to say something negatively, you say ein. So here's the positive, right? There is a man in the field. You could switch that yesh to ein, and it would be translated, there is not a man in the field. Or there are people in the field. Switch that to ein, there are not people in the field. Ein can also be used to negate a noun sentence. So if you have ata ish, like you are a man, you can put ein ata ish, you are not a man. Now the word lo is used to negate sentences in the perfect or the imperfect, right? So you have lo, and we have examples here. You can look at that in your textbook. Lo is used with verbs typically. The words ein can be used with a noun sentence or with a participle, as we'll see later on. The words ein and lo do not need to agree with any other word in the sentence. Ein does not inflect, just like yesh. Okay, the last thing that I want to highlight here is the conjugation of the verb haya. I would memorize these and be very familiar with them for a couple reasons. One is because it's a very common word. There is, or, it's the word be, become, is, haya. But also because it's highly irregular. And so it's just good to be able to know how to inflect it. It does follow a lot of the things we talked about, like in the perfect, there is that atatati utemtenu ending, where you have a, ta, t, ti, u, tem, tenu. But, it's like a third hey verb. It switches to a yod in some places. It just looks a little bit different. And then you got this weird sagol combination vowel when you get down into the second person plurals. So it's just helpful to be really familiar with that. Similarly with the imperfect, it has some unusual features, so it's good to be familiar with those.